I have one more rant to give about season 1 of the Wheel of Time TV show, and then I swear to God I am done with this until there's something new to react to. We need to talk about how the TV show's themes deviate from the books, or at least what has been revealed of them so far in season 1. First, here is the theme of the books as proclaimed by Robert Jordan. The main thrust of the story will explore the nature of good and evil, of free will and the duty owed by the individual to humanity as a whole, of why and how mankind makes the choice to oppose evil, and the harm that can be done in the name of good. Now, I don't know if the TV show is going to deviate substantially from this overall theme. We do get a bit of the free will angle from the first season, so there is some hope that the overall story is going to capture this, at least to some degree. But another big theme of the books is the concept of gender equality and cooperation between the sexes, which the show has really messed up in ways that are honestly baffling and lean somewhat towards misandry, or at least it can be interpreted that way. In a previous video, I said that I would not call the show woke, and I am going to stick to that. I really dislike that framing for reasons that I will explain later in this video. What I am going to do instead is elaborate on the show's modern feminism and why it doesn't resonate with me, who is a modern feminist. First, it's not really a mystery that the Wheel of Time TV show is trying to lean into something that the showrunner of the show, Rafe Judkins, calls feminism in today's context. Here's a tweet from him from like 3 years ago. I'm a feminist, and it's very important to me that the show is feminist in today's context. So a lot of those things will be changing. By those things changing, Rafe is responding to a question about the rigid Mars-Venus gender division being a problematic aspect of the Wheel of Time book series. Here's another tweet. Many female villains getting raped or ending up in permanent bondage while males just die. Rigid Mars-Venus gender division, etc. These are troubling aspects of the books. Plans to update, improve these. Watt's great to discuss gender, but it isn't without problems. Here's my problem. I'm a feminist too, and I'm a feminist in support of all the waves of feminism, which I'll explain in a bit. But changing the Wheel of Time to remove the gender division is a bad decision. It's a core conflict in the story. Cooperation between genders that have been divided for 3,000 years is a central theme of this book series. It's also the basis for the magic system. And it's fine with me if some people don't like this aspect of the book, if they find it troubling or don't like other things about them. I've heard all of the criticism of the Wheel of Time. It's legitimate if you don't enjoy the book series. Feel free to critique it, feel free to say what you don't think it gets right about gender equality or about writing women. But if Rafe Judkins wants to produce the TV show by removing the core theme of the book series and just rewrite the entire plot of the story, he's better off just not adapting it at all. And this is just a personal opinion of mine, but if you don't care for the book's central themes of gender equality and cooperation between divided groups being necessary to defeat evil, adapt some other series that will allow you to explore the themes that do interest you. Or write your own story, but don't deface someone else's art. I would rather have seen the Wheel of Time adapted faithfully and have people critique it in the same way that the books have been critiqued for years than witness this clumsy, ill-begotten attempt at a rewrite. In my opinion, all they succeeded in doing is to make an interesting fantasy world generic and to make one of the best magic systems in fantasy boring. In case you're not convinced that that actually happened, here's some evidence. On Wednesday, December 29th, 2021, after the series aired, Gizmodo published an article titled, "The Wheel of Time TV series works because of the changes, not despite them," which states, "The Wheel of Time show has modernized and focused the sprawling, Byzantine, and more than occasionally problematic narrative, tossing aside the novel's obstinate adherence to the gender binary is a welcome and inclusive update. The fact that this article is in Gizmodo and references Rafe Judkins by name in the subtitle tells me that Judkins heard the criticism after episode 8 and ran to his friends in the press with an explanation, hoping to direct public opinion with his own messaging, while not actually owning the decisions he made by putting his name on it. I'm going to state again that I like diversity and inclusion in my media, but I would argue that the original story was already pretty diverse and inclusive. The changes made to this story to reflect Rafe Judkins' feminism in today's context is meaningless pandering. This TV show does nothing for feminism that I can discern. In fact, what he ends up producing kind of undermines feminism and what makes the story good. There were better ways to be more inclusive than to completely rewrite the story so that the lore is offensive to men, the plot is illogical, the women are the only characters that do anything of note, and there are a lot more meaningless sex scenes. Please don't call that feminism. I'd like to ascribe positive intent to the showrunner, that he was trying to do something good, but maybe just lacks the competence to pull it off. This is depressingly common in the world of TV and movie making, which has a tradition of underestimating how hard writing actually is. Here's what Judkins had to say in a previous interview. Judkins: I think what's exciting about the Wheel of Time TV series and what was exciting about the books in the 90s is that they opened up a conversation about gender and how gender is represented in all these different cultures within the Wheel of Time. Because it's not just one way you see a lot of different representations of gender. You see things that are more binary and less binary. If Rafe Judkins had stopped at that first part, I would have been pleased. Yes, the original story does open up a very interesting conversation about gender. It presents the concept of gender as a cultural conceit. Just so we're all on the same page here, what this is referencing is the concept that your sex and the expectations of how to present in the world as your assigned gender are different things. Here's a rough example. Women are associated with pink, while boys are associated with blue. Women are weak, while men are strong. Women are sensitive, while men are stoic. Women are emotional, while men are logical. Women represent a beautiful aesthetic, whereas men are encouraged to be powerful. Women are submissive, while men must dominate. Women are warm, while men are tough. Women are nurturers, men are providers. Women are gatherers, men are hunters. Women like activities like baking and sewing, while men like fighting and sports. Women serve and men rule. Women are dependent, while men are independent. And women are passive, as in they are saved, while men are active, as in they save others. As a feminist, I do not believe that women and men should be rigidly divided along gender stereotypes or presumed roles, not these and also not other ones that exist in the world. Strict adherence to this kind of a model limits potential and constrains natural development in a manner that I think is unhealthy. I'm a cis-het woman and I don't necessarily want to be anything else, but I do identify with some of the listed male traits more than the female ones, and I think that's okay. Those who have actually read the Wheel of Time book series and understand it know that the magic system has a gender divide. In the books, channeling the one power is tied to the soul, and the souls have genders. The one power is split into two halves, a male half called Sadine and a female half called Sadar. However, the way gender presents in the story is not binary. Some cultures have more traditionally established roles for men and women, while in others, it's a lot more fluid. The genders do exist though, and so do differences between the genders. It's just not a rigid model that dictates how people dress, what their personality is, or their behaviors. As Rand breaks the world, cultures start to blend together so that the gender performances become even less binary over time. And that to me seems like a fairly accurate representation of what is actually true in the world still today. That seems like an interesting conversation to have, as Our modern politics are, unfortunately, just now catching up to these ideas that Robert Jordan presented over 30 years ago. There are still a lot of people who can't define how sex and gender differ, so let's have that conversation. But Rafe Judkins doesn't do this. Instead, he goes on to ruin the possibility of having this conversation by saying that the TV show needs to continue to explore what gender means for these characters in as fresh of a context today as Robert Jordan was working on in the 90s. He thinks the TV show needs to push the envelope, but he does not explain what this means. Apparently, it means that all of the characters need to be rewritten. He also feels that he has to change the binary aspect of the magic system to be non-binary, or at least not explicitly binary, and to remove all concept of cultures clashing over different notions of gender, at least in what we've seen so far. Here is Rafe Judkins explaining the changes that have to be made to modernize the series. Judkins: I think, well, I can't tell you all of them, but in the books, there's an idea that if you're born as a man in one life, you'd be born as a man in the next life in the show. We're not doing that. We're approaching it as you are a soul and you move through different bodies through whatever life you're in, so that's one. It's a very fundamental change, actually, to make to the book series, and it has a lot of ripple effects, and we'll continue to do things like that I think are more reflective of, hopefully, what Robert Jordan would be writing if he was writing today. Here's the thing though, I don't think that this accomplishes what Rafe Judkins intends, and I think that the ripple effects of dismantling how the metaphysical reality in the Wheel of Time works is pretty extreme. It necessitates changing the lore so that the Dragon Reborn can possibly be born female, and that has a lot of impacts, as we have already discussed. Here's Judkins on that very topic. I think the idea that the Dragon Reborn doesn't necessarily need to only be a male character, that's really important. We see that play out in a number of different ways through the season. Also, as we learn, some of the dragons of the past were women. How is that different? How did that affect the world? So that one change that we've made, it really does flutter throughout the whole series. I think it's good to make changes like that and to put them in the show, even if it does have those effects. And here's where I think Rafe Judkins is being more than a bit arrogant, because allowing for the possibility of the Dragon Reborn to be female is much more than just a flutter. It's a tidal wave. In the hands of a more competent writer, it could completely change the world and the story that is being told. Think about it. If the world could be saved by a woman, the Aes Sedai would be incentivized to ensure the Dragon Reborn is a woman. That also would completely change the plot of the story. The Dragon Reborn being a woman is also something that was brought up when Robert Jordan was still alive, and he specifically said that it was impossible. Here's Robert Jordan. It would be the same soul. That is the belief of the world that I've set up, that it is the same soul. It's the soul of someone bound to the wheel, which is spun out for the wheel's purposes really, to attempt to rebalance the weaving of the pattern. But the soul would always be male. Souls don't change gender, so the soul of the Dragon Reborn is always going to be male, just as Brigitta's soul is always going to be born as a woman, just as Amarasu's soul is always going to be born as a woman. There are divisions here, and they are not interchangeable. And again, I get that Rafe Judkins is trying to do something noble, or at least that is what he's presenting as the reason he made these changes, but he's making a lot of assumptions, and the stance he takes is more than a little bit arrogant. He's making assumptions about what makes the story popular, about what modern feminism means to women and other feminists, about what changes are needed to make the story more inclusive to people who might have felt excluded by a gender binary. Was any actual market research done to inform any of this? Or did Judkins just take his cues from some casual tweets? I also think it's a little insulting to suggest that Robert Jordan, who spent his whole life thinking about these concepts, would agree that everything he wrote about gender in the 90s was wrong and would overhaul his magic system and the plot of his books to allow people's souls to be non-gendered. I don't believe there is any basis for this. How do we know that Robert Jordan wouldn't link arms with J.K. Rowling on this issue and insist that men and women exist and are different based on a mix of biological differences and culturally enforced norms. I very well think he might have. Of course, it's impossible to know, but that's all the more reason to adapt the story as originally conceived by the author rather than overhaul it in your own image. I want to have these conversations on the issues that are presented by the books, but I still want the Wheel of Time TV show to be the Wheel of Time so that we can do that more effectively. I mean, to me, what is so striking and lovely about this book series is that it presented a world with no racism and no sexism. There is rampant gender prejudice, yes, to the point of being fairly annoying, but there isn't systemic dominance of one gender over another, except in cultural pockets like formatting. Robert Jordan's execution of a gender-balanced world isn't perfect, I'm not saying that, but it was successful at sparking conversations, and people like to read and reread these books in part because they are so philosophically interesting. The numerous gender-charged arguments get criticized a lot, and for good reason, but it's also partly what draws your attention to the gender equality, so that's art. As far as making the story more inclusive to people who are trans, I fully support that. I personally would not have objected to a smaller change, like allowing for gendered souls to sometimes be spun by the wheel into the wrong bodies, maybe as an interference by the Dark One to sow chaos. That would have been way less disruptive to the lore, and there's even precedent for it in the books, with Arengar having a man's soul and wielding Sadine in a woman's body. It also would have been more poignant, as you would be able to show the distress that gender dysphoria has on people in the real world today who feel that their soul does not match their body. Channelers born into the wrong bodies would probably have a high fatality rate too, since no one would know to look for them in order to teach them to control their power, and it could be something that is discovered and addressed by the changes that sweep the world with the coming of the Dragon Reborn. That could have been really, really interesting. As for non-binary people, in my personal belief, I think that there are many examples in the Wheel of Time book series already of individuals who buck the expectations of their gender performance, as well as whole cultures and societies that don't align to traditional gender stereotypes as we know them. Changing the magic system was arguably, therefore, not necessary to be inclusive to non-binary people. But here's the bigger thing. As it stands, the Wheel of Time TV series, in my opinion, has not pushed the envelope on any of this. There is no interesting commentary in the TV show's first season about anything remotely related to gender binary or any idea of feminism that I recognize as progressive. All we get is a magic system that doesn't seem to have rules and male characters who don't do anything, with references that men are to blame for all of the world's woes. Rafe Judkins also seems completely unaware that what he has done to dismantle the gender divide in the One Power is essentially how the Dark One is released into the world in the books. So, in the Age of Legends, Miriam Sedai sought a new kind of power that didn't require cooperation between the sexes. She and a scientific researcher, a man named Betamon, bored a hole in the pattern to access this power called the True Power, which is what enables the Dark One to touch the world. Incidentally, the Dark One is pure evil in the sense that he is a great nothing, a narcissist of epic metaphysical proportions who wants to, in a sense, end diversity. Is that philosophy not progressive enough? What I mean is that the Dark One wants to bind the pattern to him, thread by thread, life by life, until the wheel stops turning, the Great Serpent is slain, and the whole pattern essentially becomes him. He convinces threads, or lives, to turn to the dark through lying, by promising dark friends anything and everything they want, usually status, power, fame, glory, money, the ability to crush one's enemies, that kind of thing. He also cultivates division among his own followers, even when it makes them less effective, because division serves his overall strategy. His whole thing is to turn people against each other. The dragon is the champion of the light who rises up to fight the shadow. The dragon is bound closely to the wheel, which is why turning the dragon would result in a victory for the Dark One. In the books, Lews Therin Telamon, the dragon of the Age of Legends, does not turn, but is also unable to convince the women Aes Sedai to help him seal the boar, which is why the seals fail, because they are only made with Saidin when they actually have to be made with both Saidin and Saidar. This division between the sexes causes all of the calamity that takes place in the books. 3,000 years later, the divide between men and women has gotten worse and worse, which is when the dragon is reborn. Do you see how messing with the gender binary unravels the core of the story and in some ways serves the Dark One? We are supposed to argue about gender roles. There are supposed to be differences between people and between cultures. We are supposed to all be individuals who are independent, but who also belong to many groups, some of which do not agree. The biggest theme in the Wheel of Time book series is that people who don't see eye to eye must cooperate. Men and women must cooperate, but it's not just men and women. Nations must cooperate. The White Tower and the Black Tower must cooperate. There are countless other divisions that exemplify this theme. The Aes Sedai and the Wise Ones, the Sea Folk and the Landlocked, the White Cloaks and pretty much everyone else who isn't subscribed to their ideal of faith, the Aiel and the Wetlanders, the Country Folk and the Nobility. Everyone must work together. Everyone must find common ground and agree that defeating the Dark One is more important than whatever petty differences divide them. Differences in an opinion by culture or allegiance to whatever team you think you are on is less important than defeating evil itself. In the books, the Dark One does not become powerful because of the arrogance of men. It is because the people were divided and there was a lack of cooperation between the sexes especially. Both halves of the true source are needed to power the Wheel of Time, and the pattern must be woven by individual lives or individual threads that create this tapestry of such diversity that it is strong enough to keep the Dark One out. This theme about cooperation in times of division is very topical for our times today. It's one of the reasons that I was so excited for this production, but the Wheel of Time TV show does not seem to want to have this conversation or necessarily even alludes that it understands these themes, at least not so far in season 1. Prior to episode 8, you could have excused the confusion on misinformation. That's a theme in the books too. The Forsaken in particular are famous or infamous not just for betraying the light, but for doing so by propaganda and deceit. It's not a stretch to think that we shouldn't take Liandrin's view that men make the one power filthy as gospel. She's a villain, obviously, and even Moiraine's comment about the arrogance of men at the beginning of the show can be excused if you lean into the messaging that Aes Sedai may not know as much as they say they do. But then we got that cold open in episode 8, and Lews Therin saying that he's going to seal away darkness itself. He's warned against it by a woman, and then he's punished for his hubris. 3,000 years later, it's men who are tainted. Men themselves make the one power filthy, rather than the one power having a male half that was tainted by the Dark One in a counterstrike. So Liandrin was right. In the TV show, men's very bodies are tainted, or perhaps it's the concept of masculinity itself that is tainted. Is this what Rafe Judkins means by feminist in today's context? I said in my last video that people can be forgiven for feeling that this show is misandrist or man-hating. It does come off that way, and not just because of this twist on male arrogance breaking the world being confirmed at the end of the season. The male characters also don't do anything in this show except steal from their neighbors, murder their wives, and try to undermine their girlfriends' ambitions. And it's not the characters being prejudiced against men, which I could maybe understand. I'm not necessarily opposed to the concept of a fantasy series that is set in a world that is sexist against men. I don't want to live in that world, but speculative fiction can be thought-provoking, and one purpose of art is to challenge preconceived ideas and explore new ways of thinking. I mean, that's not the story that Robert Jordan wrote, and I wouldn't prefer it over the story that he wrote. It's not the Wheel of Time book series, but it's feasible as a reimagining of this world and a new turning of the wheel. However, if they were going to go to that extreme, I would want the ultimate message to still be that men and women are equal or should be equal, in which case masculinity should be just as honored as femininity. But that's not what the TV show does. The world is not presented to us as a place where women are oppressed and need feminism to gain equality. It's also not presented as a world where men are oppressed and need to regain equality. We don't see men in this world systemically maligned by political structures that place women and femininity in positions of power over them. The male characters aren't scrappy heroes overcoming stereotypes that they are tainted. There aren't female allies fighting for men's rights or anything like that. Instead, the writers just seem to favor the women, which is an altogether different thing. Instead of a thoughtful commentary on how inequality hurts everyone, you have a story that shoves the male characters aside or makes them accessories to the women. Is that a commentary on what films and television shows have been doing to women for decades? Maybe, but if so, it's a big blah in this context. It doesn't seem self-aware or intentional. It just leaves the audience dissatisfied and confused. And I want to be clear, in absolutely no context is this woke. As I mentioned, I have a lot of objections to woke as a framework to try and malign art and entertainment, but I'm specifically talking about people trying to claim that the representation in the Wheel of Time TV show is fourth wave feminism. It's not. Here is the definition of feminism. Feminism, it's a noun. The belief that women should be allowed the same rights, power, and opportunities as men, and to be treated in the same way, or a set of activities intended to achieve this state. First, let's address the obvious. Are there feminists who hate men? Yeah, they exist. Robert Jordan even represented them in the Red Aja. But do man-hating women become revered leaders and heroes of the feminist movement? Not typically. Outrage can get you noticed, but radicals who propose a violent, reductionist agenda of us versus them, even to right wrongs that are legitimate, rarely come out on top in history in any movement. We literally see the results of this in the Wheel of Time through the character of Elida, who represents what happens when an extremist obtains a position of power. It is difficult to build a political movement on nothing but outrage. It's also difficult to identify everyone who needs to be included in that outrage. Feminism has grappled with inclusion. It's partially what the waves signify. However, it should be noted that the waves of feminism are just a framework to analyze periods in history when the conversation got louder and what drove that crescendo. The conversations are generally always happening, and there's always a lot of disagreement in opinion and goals and who even deserves to be in that conversation. A little bit of history on this, even though I am not a historian, so take it with a grain of salt, but the first wave was suffrage. Women wanted the vote. They particularly wanted it in America after black men got the right to vote in 1870. Abolition and women's suffrage were often purported together, but they did not get the same rights at the same time. There had also been very extensive messaging for centuries to convince everyone who benefited economically from the transatlantic slave trade that black people were basically animals. And this is horrific, so I'm not going to show examples of it, but the passage of legislation to give black men the right to vote, but to deny that same right to women, communicated something. Not that that messaging didn't continue for another 50 years, and in some instances still today, or that everyone had the right to vote when women's suffrage passed, but I don't have time to go into the entirety of voting rights history in the United States. I will drop some links below if you would like to do some of that research on your own. It is unsurprising, though, that the second wave of feminism corresponded with the civil rights legislation. Women marched alongside Black Americans for jobs and equal pay, among other things. After all, women had occupied all of the jobs that men couldn't during World War II, with government-sponsored childcare to enable it. But women were only paid about half of what men had been during that time. Despite being a really good deal economically for those businesses, all of the women were dismissed from those jobs when the men came home. The Equal Pay Act was passed in 1963 to require that women be paid equally for equal work, which is something that we are still working on, as there is still a gender pay gap, although there is a lot of confusion about it. But that's a topic for another video. Civil rights was a fast follow in 1964. The second wave of feminism wasn't a universal triumph, though. The Equal Pay Act did not end wage discrimination, just as civil rights did not end racism. And it might be worth pointing out that a lot of what was accomplished in the 60s was actually because America was trying to show that it was different from Soviet Russia. In other words, the US wanted to have some clout, that Americans didn't treat people the way people were treated under communism. The division between the capitalist West and the communist East was established over moral grounds. However, the United States had a hard time convincing other nations of their credibility as a moral superpower, with Jim Crow laws separating whites and blacks in the South, so that had to go. But it didn't end racism. It also didn't make sure that women had equal rights on all fronts. It also wasn't very inclusive to all women of all races. Both first and second wave feminism largely focused on equality for white women. The Equal Pay Act didn't really address equal pay for women who were not white. And to skip some things here because we have limited time, but in the 80s, anti-feminism took hold, with feminists being painted as these angry, disaffected women who are probably lesbians or who would end up alone and bitter because they hate men. With messaging like this, a lot of women started to declare that they weren't feminists. But third wave feminism came in the 90s in reaction to this, as well as reaction to continued lack of equality and also attempting to address intersectionality. We started to talk about how race, gender, and sexuality intersect to create multiple layers of oppression. The transgender community allied with feminists during this wave, and LGBT rights started to gain traction as well. In the 90s, women were still blocked from many types of jobs based on gender stereotypes that women belonged in the home, or only in jobs that are associated with homemaking activities, or were nurturing, or were service positions, or had something to do with aesthetics. We also had the Anita Hill trial in the 90s, which ignited public outrage over sexual harassment in the workplace. Third wave feminism also opposed slut-shaming, body-shaming, and sexual objectification of women. Now you might be thinking, hold on, I thought some of that was fourth wave feminism, and yeah, it is, it still is. The issues elevated in the 90s are still issues today, at least in part. It's debatable that third wave feminism ever ended, or if the definition of what it means to be inclusive is just expanding. In some ways, fourth wave feminism may just be a shift of the conversation to online spaces. We are able to look back at the previous waves of feminism and reflect about what we got wrong or what still isn't fixed. The Me Too and Time's Up movements are certainly associated with the fourth wave, but raising awareness around sexual assault was already part of the movement. Me Too just emphasized how widespread sexual assault experiences are for women, even if not all men perpetuate these offenses. The conversation around gender roles, what feminine and masculine actually mean or should mean, and whether gender is a performance is simply becoming more widespread and visible via social media channels. LGBTQI+ rights and representation have also come more into the spotlight, with the letters continually expanding to be more inclusive of the differences between sex, gender identity, gender expression, physical attraction, and emotional attraction. Some interpret fourth wave feminism as centering queer in order to normalize and destigmatize it. So, where does the Wheel of Time TV show fit into this? In my opinion, it doesn't. The Wheel of Time TV show doesn't offer any interesting education or commentary on any of this. If you want to watch something that does, watch Sex Education, or Insecure, or the She-Ra remake, which I thought was really entertaining. The Wheel of Time TV show doesn't say anything interesting about gender roles, gender identity, or gender expression. This is infuriating because the books have quite a lot to say about this, and the framework as written would have sparked so much more interesting conversation on the topic than this amorphous nonsense that we got instead. Instead of a gender-based magic system with hard rules, which is at least inherently interesting and would elicit discussion, we have an unexplained magic system with no rules or limitations, which is boring. Instead of many interpretations of how gender is perceived and performed by different cultures, it seems to be the same everywhere that these characters travel, at least so far. But the thing I really can't accept is this notion that men are tainted for being arrogant, rather than the power that they wield in this fantasy universe, as if it is men's biological bodies, or perhaps masculinity itself, that is the antagonist of the story, and that the solution is for men to step down or stand aside while women do everything. That is not the Wheel of Time. It's also not feminism. Or at least it is a very radical edge case notion of feminism that not many people subscribe to. The notion that men have to step down or stand aside for women to advance should not apply to characters in a fantasy world, especially not a fantasy world where the genders are already balanced, and not in terms of what they do as people within that world. Doing that tilts the world into misandry. In the real world, this concept of men stepping down or stepping aside applies to limited positions of wealth and power that have been closed to women. So like, I don't know, ensuring your TV show has an equal number of female executive producers that are also paid the same as the male producers and whose opinions are equally weighted. Now, the TV show might be trying to do this, and if so, that's commendable. That's an interview that I would be interested in. Show me equity, diversity, inclusion for real people involved in this production. Don't write weak characters and misandrist plot lines and call that feminism. Because that's what this show boils down to. Weak writing and half-baked philosophies that don't deliver much of a story. This is not a show trying to be avant-garde. It is not a show trying to push the envelope. It is a generic fantasy that seems to be trying to cram its source material into safe current trends. Criticism of the show has been met with accusations of homophobia, racism, or sexism, as if the only reason that anyone could possibly not like this interpretation is because the women are strong and diverse and one of them is queer. Rafe Judkins has actually said that he delights in angering anti-woke people, by which he seems to mean racist or homophobic people based on tweets such as this one. Got my first death threat today. You are all very kind. I've dealt with them before, and there's truly only one way to respond: turn their favorite characters gay. Because I can. This gentleman reaps what he sows. Perrin and Lan are now gay for each other. Next homophobic death threat: Egwene and Daze Congar. Now, a couple of things here. First, I have to acknowledge that racist and homophobic people do exist, and they are pretty irate about diversity and inclusion in any media, which does include the Wheel of Time. So death threats are plausible, they do happen. Second, I am not advocating that Rafe Judkins or anyone associated with the show deserves to be sent death threats, canceled, or harassed online or off ever for any reason, but especially not for trying, however ham-fistedly, to be inclusive in some creative endeavor. No one has omnipotent understanding of all human experiences. Art is always going to be subjective, and it's always going to reflect an individual's limited knowledge, perspective, and values. I think mistakes were made with this show. I'm annoyed about it. But the proper response is just to not watch it, or to criticize it, or to try to instruct so that they can do better in future seasons. Don't harass or abuse anyone verbally or physically. You cannot like something and still be kind to the person who made it. So now comes the point where I have to talk about woke entertainment or anti-woke entertainment. And honestly, this is a bigger conversation than I have time to unpack here. However, I think that some context is relevant to understanding Rafe's tweet. So here's where I have to briefly try to explain why using this word woke to malign art and entertainment is ineffective at best. The issue is that I don't know what anyone means when they use this word. By my calculations, there are at least 3 definitions for how people think they are being perceived when they say woke. 1. Woke, adjective, slang for awake, meaning alert or aware of racial or sexist oppression in the real world or reflected in art, media, and entertainment. Definition number 2, woke, adjective, a pejorative to malign diversity and inclusion in media and entertainment, especially characters in prominent or heroic roles or in defiance of traditional gender norms. Definition number 3, woke, adjective, a pejorative to criticize art, media, and entertainment that is only performatively anti-racist or feminist through token representation. Most likely, if you are a reasonable person who objects to being called racist or sexist for disliking some TV show or movie, you probably put yourself into the 3rd category when you use the term woke. You probably mean that said TV show or movie just isn't very good, and that swapping the races or genders of iconic characters to create a fresh take on an established story or franchise doesn't automatically make the characters interesting or the story very good. And okay, but the problem is that there are a lot of people who fall into the 2nd category, and they are actively flooding the internet with content to try to persuade people in the 3rd category or the undecided that the reason they disliked some TV show or film is because it features diverse characters or progressive messages. There are people who are consciously or unconsciously racist and or homophobic and or sexist who believe that women achieving equality to men will destroy the world. So the slithery tactic to win the culture war is to associate some negative feelings you have with some TV show or movie with an illogical conclusion. So the show movie is bad and has diverse characters and progressive themes becomes the show movie is bad because it has diverse characters and progressive themes. And I just have to say, lots of TV shows and movies are bad. We're not living in some kind of a new age where suddenly this is happening like it's never happened before. Have always been bad TV shows and movies. I can't count how many bad action movies I have seen that star some generic white male hero that is not interesting and a plotline that stretches the suspense of disbelief. Hollywood is just producing the same type of lazy movie with female lead characters and other types of diverse characters. Who cares? Don't fall into this trap that media can be divided into good and woke. A better framework would be good or bad, or enjoyable or not enjoyable, based on the story being entertaining or not entertaining, or logical or not logical. You could also maybe talk about progressive woke or performative woke if you have the context to understand and elucidate the difference on something that has actual literary merit versus media that is just trying to check some boxes. But you should note that such judgment is subjective and that it's also possible to be a little bit right and a little bit wrong. A piece of art or a person producing it can be brilliant in one area and wildly ignorant in another. See Aristotle, Freud, or Rousseau's philosophies on women. I'm just gonna leave this here. Now, let's look back at the Wheel of Time. To me, the Wheel of Time TV show can't possibly meet that first definition of woke. I wasn't alerted to any oppressions that are meaningful and worthy of greater visibility by watching the show, unless maybe it's the mistreatment of men by the screenwriters. The Wheel of Time TV show does have a diverse cast of characters, but that by itself isn't woke, just great to see. Although I do acknowledge that some element of encountering diversity through striking out from one's comfort zone to embark on adventure was lost with this approach. Still, the real problem, in my opinion, is that the Wheel of Time TV show just feels like fan fiction written by someone who just enjoys screwing with the canon. It didn't even really develop its characters or explain the world they live in. It is sparking a conversation, but not in the way that was intended, and certainly not pushing the envelope on any progressive message. So this could mean that the Wheel of Time TV show falls under that third definition of woke, where being inclusive might be more performative than meaningful, either out of ignorance or out of a desire for social capital. But honestly, this is a tangent. I would need to do a whole video or a whole video series on wokeness to explain this context properly. Let's get back to this tweet. I would like to ascribe positive intent to the showrunner here. I know that Rafe Judkins is a gay man. He has probably suffered from discrimination at some point in his life and has probably been a target for homophobia. I want to believe also that Rafe does love the Wheel of Time books and just wants to tell the story in a manner that is more inclusive to him and also to other people who didn't get as represented in the story as it was written in the 90s, in a manner that probably would have seen more representation today. In this tweet, I see him rejecting haters. I also get that he is mostly joking, but I don't think that he is entirely joking. I don't think that there is any evidence to suggest that Robert Jordan's original story is sacred to Rafe Judkins. I don't think telling the original story is his ambition or aim. He is using the popularity of the source material to do his own thing for his own reasons. And I don't know what those are. Does the result have to be bad? Not necessarily. I really did try to separate myself from the original story, to try and absorb this new turning of the wheel to see if it works as its own piece of art in our modern context. I just don't think it's very good. Rafe seems confident that he's plugged all of the holes in the lore, but I don't think that he has. I am concerned that he doesn't understand the ramifications of the changes that he has made, or that he doesn't care if the story makes sense or delivers a good message. For example, here are some potential problems that I see with how things have changed in the first season. 1. How exactly are men tainted if Sadine doesn't exist? Is it men's biological bodies that are drawing the taint? Or is it their masculinity? Are we to believe that Leandrin is right when she says that men make the power filthy just by being men? Does this imply that men are inherently unclean and unworthy, or that masculinity is? 2. If the dragon caused this disaster, rather than being a hero that fought the shadow with insufficient support, what's the point of the dragon even being reborn? Why isn't Latra reborn to fix this problem? Like, why do they need a dragon? If the Dark One can't escape and there is no last battle prophesized, and the dragon is reborn a man but could be reborn a woman, can't the Aes Sedai just kill him and wait for the next reincarnation until they get a girl who won't go mad and die? If the point of making these changes was to be more inclusive of trans people or non-binary people, are they affected by the taint? Like, can men escape the taint by becoming women or becoming more feminine or rejecting masculinity? Is that where the show is going in terms of its messaging? Most importantly, it seems unlikely that men and women will have to cooperate to do anything that neither can accomplish alone in this version of the story. If both men and women theoretically draw from the same power source, then there's nothing that women can't do without men. Are men even needed in this story? Again, will we be seeing some kind of messaging that masculinity needs to disappear? in order to have balance. I want to reiterate that this is not Robert Jordan's story. Robert Jordan intentionally created a fantasy world based on the concept of duality, good and evil, light and dark, male and female. One of the biggest themes of the story is that men and women need to work together, that only by cooperation between the sexes can really challenging problems ever be solved. I would have loved for this show to lean in harder on the themes that are actually in the books, the themes that Robert Jordan spent almost 20 years writing and probably a lot more time thinking about. Show us that there is no such thing as a savior, that being chosen is a raw deal, that putting all of the burden of saving the world or saving a nation or saving a people on one individual's shoulders will lead to madness, quite literally. Show us that people must band together to create meaningful change. Challenge us to judge slowly and to reflect on how differences between people by culture or personality aren't bad and actually make us stronger. Demonstrate the impacts of misinformation and disinformation, that rumors planted by bad faith actors, personified by the Forsaken, who are described as expert propagandists in the books, can level nations and divide peoples with catastrophic consequences. Teach us how to sort truth from lies, when to trust and why, and when to be skeptical and why. Show us why it's so critical for people on opposing sides, whatever divides them, to recognize when they need to cooperate, even when they disagree. Demonstrate that union, rather than division, is the only thing that can save humanity from darkness, that is the only way to defeat evil. Do I have to explain how this messaging would be very topical for the times that we are living in now, and that it would be very positive messaging? It's possible that future seasons will get us there, but I do have misgivings. My biggest fear is that the decisions that were made to change the lore, the themes, the plot, the characters, and the overall story were not made to be woke or to impart any kind of positive message specific to our times. My fear is that they were made for attention, to solicit outrage, to intentionally divide the fan base, but ultimately for fame and advancement and money. As we wait to see what the show will deliver in season 2, I'll leave you to reflect on these final words.